Contrary to popular belief amongst gun control advocates, there is a psychological diversity within the gun communities of America. Responsible gun owners use guns to mitigate fear. Gun nuts, however, use guns to instill fear, because to them, fear equals respect. Holding a gun means respect equals easy, unearned power. Just another manifestation of inauthentic, narcissistic social entitlement. It's inauthentic because they think they're earning respect when all they're doing is purchasing the ability to instill fear, which is a narcissistic disposition because it implies that the gun owner's life is more important than anyone else's. Since the gun owner purchases the gun, the concept of consumer entitlement comes with the ownership of that gun. Of course, I have the right to hold the power to end life in the palm of my hand because I'm an entitled American consumer. When a MAGA gun lover hates his job and hates his woman, if he's lucky enough to even have a woman, that kind of easy, unearned power becomes addictive. Remember Frank Schaeffer's crazy Christian certainty addicts? Well, is there anything more certain than who's in charge when someone's got a gun? There are three classes of gun owners in Trump-era America. Home gun owners are usually just people who own a small gun, maybe two, stored in a lockbox to defend themselves in the event of a break-in or carjacking. Responsible gun owners, also known as gun enthusiasts, own more than one gun, spend time at the gun range, socialize with friends they've met through the gun culture, and many of them are just serious hunters. Gun enthusiasts have at least one other source of fulfillment in their lives outside of guns. Maybe they're passionate about their jobs and find their work fulfilling. Maybe the gun enthusiast is a truly loving dad and his kids actually like him, as opposed to just being afraid of him. Maybe the gun enthusiast has another hobby, such as golf or fishing. The point is, the gun enthusiast isn't obsessed with guns. He likes guns. He might even think he loves guns, but he doesn't actually love guns because he has at least some friends and family in his life, and those relationships implicitly teach him that you can't love something that can't love you back. In fact, if he is a serious family man, he probably has concerns about our third and final category of gun owner, gun nuts. More specifically, the socially isolated gun nut. I imagine the transition from responsible gun owner to gun nut is gradual for most. A conservative's obsession with guns is directly proportional to how miserable his life is. The more isolated, lonely, and purposeless his life becomes, the more time he spends with his gun, whether he's at the gun range, shooting cans in the forest, or perusing the internet for gun-related products and entertainment. The gun nut seeks pleasure by way of the greatest power any citizen can hold in their hand, the power to end life. Without invoking too many stereotypes or even giving this category of American too much credit for being complicated, the gun nuts are not inherently dangerous people. but the isolated gun nuts are. Because whether tough guy conservatives like to admit it or not, every human being requires social interaction with others to be at least content with life. When you don't have any socially fulfilling family, friends, or even acquaintances in your life, and you live in a rural area, loneliness will not only find you, it will eventually rob you of your sanity. While gun nuts are indeed problematic for our society because they listen to a right-wing propaganda machine that tells them any new gun law is a bad gun law, it is the isolated gun nut that I seek to expose as the real threat, because by doing so, there is a chance that the remainder of the gun community will acknowledge what to the rest of us feels like a fairly obvious reality of American life in the 2020s. It is only a matter of time before another isolated gun nut commits another school shooting, church shooting, concert shooting, or some other kind of mass shooting. Of all three tribes within the tribe of MAGA, Confederate flag waving, Bible beating gun nuts, gun owners that neither wave the Confederate flag nor beat their Bible might actually be intellectually accessible for the simple reason that they know isolated gun nuts exist, and they have very likely crossed paths with an isolated gun nut, either at the range or by participating in some other aspect of the gun culture. Gun owners in America today cannot and will not deny that a small percentage of people within their subculture are mentally imbalanced and should not have access to guns. Right-wingers love to talk about mental health whenever mass shootings happen, as if it's some kind of novel approach to solving this quintessentially American problem. To that I say, welcome to the party, you intellectual teenagers. Lefties have been trying to draw attention to mental health for 3/4 of a century. What do you think the purpose of more comprehensive universal background checks is? By rhetorically invoking mental health as an alternative to new gun laws, gun nut apologists implicitly admit that some percentage of their community should not have access to guns because they are crazy. The rhetorical opportunity the left is currently missing is defining the craziness of the isolated gun nuts in more specific terms. They're not just weird, they're not just different, they're lonely. And perhaps more importantly, they're angry about being lonely. They're desperate for meaningful human contact, but they're too awkward to have any success making real friends. And they're too proud to try to go about pursuing authentic relationships with others by trying anything new. Change is terrifying to these desperate souls, unless, of course, they have the power to control that change. The emotional explanation for how an isolated gun nut becomes a mass shooter is that desperation desires unearned power. Power being defined as either creating change or preventing change. The easy and unearned power that comes from owning a gun, particularly a big, powerful gun, and shooting it for fun, no doubt inspires fantasies within the gun owner's mind of having to use that gun for a righteous purpose. Over time, the reason for using the gun in these fantasies loses relevance, the more socially isolated the gun nut becomes. Without even realizing it, the gun enthusiast becomes a gun nut, when all that really matters to him is that he finally gets to use his gun on live targets, almost like a child playing with some kind of dangerous toy he knows he's too young to handle. Speaking of children, the #1 cause of death for Americans under 17 is still guns. In other developed nations with stricter gun laws, such as Canada, France, and the United Kingdom, the rate of gun violence is a small fraction of what it is in the United States. In 2019, for example, New Zealand experienced its largest mass shooting ever when a white supremacist gunned down 51 Muslims at a mosque in Christchurch. The very next week, New Zealand's Prime Minister proposed sweeping gun law reform. Within 15 months of the shooting, the Kiwis had passed 2 major pieces of gun reform, including a gun registry. Since the reforms, there have been no mass shootings in New Zealand. New Zealand is just one of many developed nations that have responded to mass shootings with vigilance, and so should we. Why does the Democratic Party rarely emphasize the need for new gun laws come campaign season? Why do those eager to see major gun reform fail to emphasize the regulated militia portion of the Second Amendment? Why won't this teenager of a country that is America simply grow up with respect to managing its gun culture? We all know the NRA owns the Republican Party, but what's the Democratic Party's excuse? The answer is fear. Specifically, the fear of alienating centrists. Kamala proudly described herself as a gun owner during last year's presidential campaign, almost as if that implied she was tougher than most Democrats, when in truth, it was just another example of Democrats playing consumer politics, telling the American public what the party thinks the American public wants to hear. Democratic Party leaders, more often than not, seek to appease the psychological predispositions of voters, whereas real political leaders do not hesitate to influence those they seek to recruit as followers when the leader knows they're in the right. The Democratic Party's current messaging on gun reform amounts to, "We're not coming for your guns, we promise." What the Democratic Party's messaging on guns should be is, if you're a responsible gun owner, you will have no problem with stricter gun laws because the new laws will be for irresponsible gun owners, not you. The obvious problem with that messaging is that Republicans have done an impeccable job of instilling mistrust between the federal government and the public in American culture since 1980. The cultural and legal challenges associated with passing major gun reform on a federal level prove that the Democratic Party must take on this Reagan-era cultural assumption of government is the problem. If the party's messaging operates according to traditional consumer politics, Democrats will never be in a position to pass major gun reform because they will always have to adhere to GOP-infused paranoia about the government taking away citizens' guns. The DNC's fecklessness on guns is therefore only a symptom of the larger problem within the party itself. Its refusal to counter Reagan's ridiculous assertion, government is the problem, with its own proclamation. Maybe something like, government is good because people are good. Until younger, more progressive leaders rise within the ranks of DNC leadership, the resurrection of the party of change will continue to be supplanted by a party of incrementalism. America's gun problem derives from the Democratic Party's reactionary culture. Until the DNC is ready to advocate for a complete redefining of the relationship between the U.S. government and the U.S. citizen, the bullets will continue to fly. The bodies will continue to drop. And politicians will continue to do nothing about it.